kind of in the central part of the continent. Just so you know, this meeting is being recorded and we will be sending out the replay afterwards. And yeah, we'll get started in just 1 minute. So thanks for joining us. Nice to see a few familiar faces out there. All right, I think I'll just dive in. It looks like we got a good crew here. I'm sure a few people will slide in. So my name's Chris Gilmore, for those that don't know me already. And I work with Earth Activist Training as a kind of a bit of a consultant. They bring me, I'm not involved with them in kind of the day-to-day work that they do, but they bring me in to teach a few courses. I'm sometimes a guest instructor at their permaculture design course, particularly coming in to talk about emergency and disaster management from kind of that holistic lens, that permaculture lens. Yeah, they have me teaching a couple courses with them online this winter. So yeah, they asked me to come in today and put something together for the community here that I think is really timely and really, really relevant. I want to do a little bit of just kind of an opening in a moment, but I'll just start with a little bit of an overview of what we're going to get up to today. My hope is for this call to be approximately an hour, so a little bit shorter than the calls we sometimes do here. And really, I want to take a topic that's often can feel very overwhelming to people, emergency and disaster management, and actually make you feel like, oh, wow, I could do this. This is maybe simpler than I thought. You know, on one level, this is a very complex topic, and on other levels, it's actually ridiculously simple. At least the frameworks for starting to break it down and approach it is actually quite simple. The nuts and bolts is where the complexity comes in. But when you have a good framework to start with, it makes it a lot easier to kind of navigate those complex pieces. So my hope is to kind of simplify this. And we called today's class Disaster Preparedness as a Resume Builder and a Community Builder. So for those of you that work in the permaculture world and you're looking to actually like open up new revenue streams for yourself, or maybe bring this to your organization, your farm, your small business, the NGO you work for, it's really great. And for people that are more interested just on a personal level, this is absolutely applicable to actually your family's well-being, your community's well-being, and kind of working on a grassroots initiative as well. So we'll be kind of discussing both of those realms. So anyways, maybe we could just start off. You could let us know where you're tuning in from today. If you know the traditional lands that you're on, it's always nice to hear that, and maybe share something that you're feeling grateful for in the chat. You know, where disaster management is often a bit of a heavy topic, and I really recognize gratitude as a survival skill in and of itself. Patterning our brain to be grateful when times are challenging can really be, you know, the thing that you need to kind of take that next step to get out of bed and to keep going. I think about that a lot. You know, some of the times in my life when I've felt the most challenged and overwhelmed were simultaneously moments where I felt the deepest level of gratitude for the things that really mattered in life. You know, my family, my loved ones, the land itself. So just going to take a little deep breath here. Maybe invite everybody. Let's even do that. Let's do a communal deep breath. It's the end of the week. People are probably a little bit tired. Who knows what you've already been up to today. I'm sure a lot of us would like to go outside. I'm looking forward. I'm going to be out on the land all weekend. I'm really looking forward to that. So maybe just a real slow inhale through the nose. And an exhale. And just feel your body relax, coming a bit more present. And maybe do one or two more on your own and just really ground in this space so you can really be present and make the most of this hour we're going to spend together. You know, taking that breath is absolutely related to emergency and disaster management as well. You know, when something happens, we often get kicked into that fight, flight, freeze scenario, which may or may not be the best thing to serve us. And patterning ourselves to actually take that breath, calm our nervous system, actually helps us to be conscious about what we actually do next as an action. So it very much, you know, it might seem like, you know, the hippy dippy woo-foo taking this breath at the beginning of the call, but it's actually very practical to life. You know, I'll defend that any day of the week, and very relevant to today's call. So, you know, my gratitude today, I just asked everyone else to share their gratitude. My gratitude today is actually for, man, all the people that are holding ancient teachings around connection to the earth and just being a healthy human being in these turbulent times. That's one that's actually been kind of the theme of my winter so far. I've been thinking about it and sitting with it quite a bit. I'm really blessed right now. I'm part of a 1-year program with Rama First Nation. So I live up in central Ontario, so Canada, Ontario. And in the what they call the Williams Treaty, which is a treaty that was signed between the government and the Anishinaabe Nation. Actually, not the entire Anishinaabe Nation, like a portion of that nation. So there's seven different bands in the Williams Treaty, and one of those is Rama First Nation. And it's a real honor that I'm working with Rama First Nation over the next year. And I sat on this teaching the other night on the 13 Anishinaabe moons. Now, this is not a teaching that I feel like I can share. I don't come from that lineage. I actually come from Scottish, Hungarian, and English lineage. Yeah, it's not really my teaching to share, but what I wanted to share and why I'm kind of bringing this up to start up our class on emergency disaster management is I was really struck by this seasonal calendar that really taught people how to live within right relations of the land, and really in a sustainable and regenerative way upon the land. And each cycle had things that you focused on. Each moon, there was life ways that you practice within those moons. And in these winter moons, there's parallels between the Anishinaabe teachings and what I've been exploring in some of my own lineage when I go over to Scotland, England, and when I look way kind of back in my lineage over there. Um, and it's this time of these longer nights, and the ability to kind of go inward and reflect and do some personal development, and hone ourselves so that when the days start to get longer again and it's time to get out on the land and do the work, we're actually prepared to go out and do that. So I say all of that to say I'm really grateful for people that are holding those teachings and those wisdoms. And I think there's a direct link between some of the disasters that we're facing right now and the need for emergency management and some of the damage that's been done to Indigenous peoples around the world that held this lineage. You know, and I'm speaking about the Indigenous peoples and the First Nations here on Turtle Island, but I also know that same story happened in my history. When my ancient Scot ancestors were literally fighting with the Romans in northern Scotland and holding down that last little bit of ground in the north there. So we all have that story, and sitting in on that 13 Moons teachings the other day has really had me exploring my own lineage to when my ancestors had that deep knowledge of the land. And I really think coming back into that deep knowledge of the land is actually something that's missing in modern day emergency management. So I tell this story to kind of share that I think there's an amazing opportunity for us coming from the permaculture world. I'm assuming a number of folks here come from the permaculture world since you're coming in through Earth Activist training, or maybe you come from the social justice world, and you're an advocate for a more equitable world. I think there's amazing opportunities for us to kind of rub off on that emergency disaster world that exists now. And simultaneously, that kind of top-down emergency disaster management world, I'm talking government, FEMA, Red Cross, here in Canada, it's Public Safety Canada. They also have some phenomenal tools that we can learn from as well, and that can help us. So this isn't so much we're right and they're wrong, or vice versa. It's actually like, how do we evolve these two worlds together? And I think we have something to offer, and I think that world has something to offer us. So I'm going to share a little. Oh, actually, one quick little shout out I want to do, and then I'm going to kind of get into the bread and butter of tonight's call. Just in honoring those Indigenous relationships and the harm that's been done there, and people doing really amazing things trying to preserve that knowledge in this modern world. I want to give a shout out to an organization here in Ontario. I'm going to put the link in the chat here. The link is indigenousaware.com. But the organization is called Cambium Indigenous Professional Services. And I've got a dear friend of mine that works over there, Carrie Ann Charles. And they're doing some amazing work kind of decolonizing emergency management and trying to bring like a real Indigenous lens and a lens rooted in the earth, a lens rooted in community and real relationships into that world. So they're doing some really fascinating work. You might want to check out the link there. I'm just going to give a little shout out to them right now as we start things off. Okay, where do we want to begin? So, a lot of people from the permaculture world, we kind of know that there is some major work to do around our food systems. We recognize the impact that food systems have on the planet, and the negative impact that current industrial agriculture has on the planet. Those of you that work in the social justice world, recognize some of the major issues we have around equality and equity in the world right now. What I want to really recognize today is this need for the EM world to be, and by EM I mean the emergency management world, to be evolved in the way that I kind of opened up with us already there. So within that, I also think there's some amazing opportunities. And one reality of this world is commerce, and the need to make money. And some of you, you might not have an interest in that, and that's great. I think you're gonna, when I start to really dive into some of the nuts and bolts here, there'll be some takeaways if you're just thinking about a family level, a personal level, a grassroots level. But, for me, it's been a real honor. Something one thing I'm thankful for every day, even on those days that are really struggling, because sometimes my work is hard, sometimes it's hard to find balance with what my personal needs, my family needs, and then like making money in my work. But in those moments, I'm so grateful that I actually feel like I'm living my vision and the work that I do is actually doing my best to work towards change in this world. And man, I'm so grateful to get paid for it, you know? Because if I didn't get paid to do this work, I would not do nearly as much of it as I do. And thus the impact that I'm able to at least attempt to have, I'm trying to have a good positive impact. I can't promise that I do the best job every day. But getting paid for it allows me to make that my focus day in and day out. And I'm so grateful for that. So for those of you that are maybe, you've done a PDC course with Earth Activist Training lately, and you're thinking about, I want to work in permaculture, I want to change the world in a good way, but I need to make a living. I got to pay bills. How do I balance this? There might be some ideas here around how you could actually add this as a new income stream to your existing permaculture consulting work. Or maybe you work with an organization already and it's an opportunity to develop your skill set and work your way up through the organization and maybe actually earn more money because of the value that you bring to that organization. Or maybe it allows you to actually go out and get a full-time job doing this work for a living. So I just kind of want to plant that seed a little bit, and we're going to share a little bit of a pathway here. So give me a second here. I'm just going to pull up my screen here. Yeah, and I've been doing, I guess the other thing I'll say is I've been doing a lot of teaching these online sessions lately through Earth Activist Training. We just did one with the Permaculture Institute in North America the other day. So we've been chatting a lot about like the nuts and bolts of like disaster response and like putting plans and stuff in place. Tonight's going to be a little less about that, and it's going to be a little bit more about actually the pathway if you want to develop this as a skill set. So it's less about diving into like what are we doing about climate change, and a little bit more about like how do you actually develop your own personal skill set. So that's why we called it disaster preparedness as a resume and community builder that we're diving into tonight. So I want to share just a little bit of sorry. I want to share just a little bit of background. I know some of you have probably heard my story already. Some of you seem like you might be new faces as well. So this will give you a little bit of context. And then after I share a little bit about my background, I'm going to share about, some suggestions around what you could do to develop the skill set for yourself. Some of the traits that I think are really important to develop. The training pathway, what that might look like, and some opportunities to actually do work in this field. So that's kind of where we're going to go over the next 45 minutes here. So my background here, that's my amazing wife, Laura there. I might be a little biased in calling her amazing, but she truly is. I think lots of people think she is as well. I'm grateful to walk this journey with her there. And, a long story short, that's very, very relevant to our topic tonight. My first passion in life was actually, I shouldn't say my first passion. One of my first biggest passions as an adult was in gardening and nature. I love the outdoors. I love canoe tripping. I love nature. I started working as a gardener, got introduced to the world of permaculture. And, pretty early on in my permaculture journey, I had this epiphany that, wow, I love this concept of sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture, but I actually don't know a lot about the forest. And how do I know that what I'm doing on this farm, because I was literally like farm hopping for like 5 years. Like that's kind of what I did when my early 20s. I just went from farm to farm to farm doing the WOOF program, Willing Workers on Organic Farms. I apprenticed on a permaculture farm for a season. And I realized, I'm calling this sustainable agriculture, but I don't actually know that much about ecology. I don't know the names of all the trees, let alone like the in-depth knowledge that indigenous peoples would have known about those trees. I don't know about the in-depth relationships between the trees and the fungi and the birds and the mammals and the insects, yet I'm saying what I'm doing is sustainable. So that sent me down this really interesting journey of wanting to actually build my naturalist knowledge, my knowledge of the land and of ecology, which kind of led me into wilderness skills and survival, as well as being fascinated with and building relations with indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge. And that whole idea of kind of decolonizing the mindset I've been brought up with and trying to think about, that indigenous perspective on this land here, which has now got me thinking about, what does indigenous look like in my own lineage far back? It's a little harder to track that one. So how this starts to really relate to the skill set tonight, though, that I'm starting to share with you, um, is so I work in emergency management now. It's one income stream that I do, and one component of what I do. I get paid for it. It feels really impactful. The people I work with tell me it's very impactful and very comforting in these challenging times. I didn't go and spend 4 years in university to get here. And that's what I want to share. I had other life experience that was actually transferable that allowed me to speed up the process and get working in it much faster than taking the traditional path. And that's not to say, you could absolutely go to college or university and study emergency disaster program. That's an option. And it's potentially a good option depending on what you want to do with it. But I'd like you to know it's maybe not the only option, and that I bet everybody on this call here has some life experience that's actually relevant and could help them speed up their learning curve that they hadn't really thought about. That is applicable. So for me, that piece was on this journey of nature connection and farming. I became a wilderness guide, and kind of the second half of my 20s, that's how I paid for myself. I would basically, in the wintertime, I did dog sled expeditions. In the summer, I did canoeing and hiking expeditions. Work with organizations like Outward Bound and whatnot, develop some skills. But when you start taking people out into the wilderness, there's a lot of risk navigation. There's also first aid. And when you're doing first aid and risk navigation, there's a mental process you need to go through to navigate the risk. And sometimes the risks actually play out. You encounter the hazard, and now you have to troubleshoot to get out of it and create safety. So I went through that process for years and realized, that when I was going into the emergency management world, wow, so I started kind of reading books on emergency management. I started thinking about, okay, how do I apply what I've done in guiding to like municipalities, to governments, like to scales of people, and realized, man, there's so many transferable skills I learned as a wilderness guide that actually helped me pick up this world of emergency management similar. The frameworks, the way of thinking is similar. So for some of you on the call right now, you might not have been a wilderness guide, but maybe you're a parent. Parents navigate risk all the time in a very dynamic way, right? They have to adapt to quickly evolving situations where there's consequences to mistakes. That's a framework that you have in a life experience that's actually applicable to learning disaster management. So I could give a bunch more examples, but one question I'll just put out to you right now is like, what life experience do you have that maybe doesn't seem related at all to emergency disaster management, but it actually is? Working with people in a social context is a huge part of emergency and disaster management, right? Maybe you're a computer programmer and you need to track crazy patterns on a screen, find the patterns, and troubleshoot them. That's actually a component of emergency management, right? So the first thing I want to share with you right now is think about those transferable skills that you might already have. So just to finish off my story, and then we'll get into some of the specifics I want to share tonight. I went from my guiding world and I decided, you know what, I'm going to start taking a few classes in emergency management. So I did a couple of certs. We had a community college that actually offered some some weekend courses on emergency disaster management. So I started just kind of picking away at a couple of certs. Thought this was really fascinating, felt really called to it. And then I decided that I wanted to actually work in this field for a little bit. And I started to explore the idea, well, maybe I'm just going to actually be like a full-time professional in this field. And I went and started looking for jobs, and I came across this company called Emergency Management and Training, Inc. And in that bottom left-hand picture there, you can see me in the orange shirt on the right there. And you'll notice it's the Emergency Operations Center at the World Conference of Disaster Management. So without a 4-year university degree, in literally under 2 years, I went from being a wilderness guide to being at the front stage at an international conference on emergency disaster management. Using permaculture, nature connection, and my guiding experience with a handful of certifications as part of the resume to actually get me into that place. I do want to share a little bit about, how I got that first job, because I think it's relevant. And then I'm going to shift away from my story and get into some specifics here. I'm going to take it off the big share there for a second here. So interesting enough, so I started looking into jobs in emergency and disaster management and found this big company and thought, wow, I'd really like to work with these folks. And I don't really know much about them. And it turned out that they were actually advertising on their Facebook page that they were looking for volunteers for this exercise they were doing in Toronto. So they were going down working with the municipality of Toronto, and they basically were looking for college students to come and be actors. And the college students got done up with makeup and paint, basically as like victims with blood and stuff like that. And they were running this mock disaster in the hospital. So I signed up for that. I show up the first morning, and I made sure to show up very early. And I roll in there, and I noticed a pattern really quick. And for those of you in the permaculture world, you might remember that first principle of permaculture: patterns into details, observation. When you start a new permaculture project, we always suggest that you actually start with a long period of observation. And that's how you learn to actually work with the land, not against the land, and work with the strengths and that are already there, right? So I actually was literally thinking about that permaculture principle of observation on my way in. I was quite nervous that morning because I knew I was going with a bunch of university students, some of them third, fourth year university, that have been studying this, and I didn't know anything. And I'm just walking into this thing. I was amazed I even got in. So I go in there and I start doing some observing right off the bat, and I start noticing some patterns. And one of them is this guy, Daryl, who runs the organization. He's actually doing a big talk to kick this thing off at this event this day. And I realized that he's overwhelmed and fluttered, and all of these students are like following him around, trying to stand out. But like they're asking him questions and they're wanting to kind of show off because they're all looking for jobs. And I had this thought that that behavior, that pattern's not actually helpful right now for Daryl, who's trying to prepare for his talk. So I was kind of sitting in the back in wide angle vision, and I was like, well, what would be helpful right now? And I thought, he's going to do a talk in a little bit. I know he's got a presentation he's going to do. I wonder if like everything's set up over there. And I actually went up to the stage without being asked, took a look around, and realized like there was no power cord set up for the projector. And I knew that he had this demo thing that he wanted to run across the stage, and there was some clutter on the stage because he had kind of given us a debrief the day before what it would look like. So I just went up, and then I went and found him a power cord, and I cleared off the stage, and I did all this stuff. And he actually noticed me up on the stage kind of doing this stuff. And here's some stranger, and I come back, walk over, and he's like, hey, who are you? And what the heck are you doing up on the stage? And I was just like, oh, I just noticed some stuff up there, and I was thinking about the email you sent, and I thought it'd be helpful. And he was like, oh, cool. Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you. So I'm not going to carry on with that story, but I played this game throughout the next kind of couple hours. We did that exercise, and literally at the end of the day, he said, hey, Chris, I got a couple projects coming up. Do you want to be on my team? And I had a job with this company. So less than 2 years, a guy with permaculture experience and guiding experience jumped ahead of fourth year university emergency disaster people by being helpful, by thinking about relationships, by tracking, which is something I've actually learned from tracking wildlife. Now, I don't tell this story to brag. I tell this story to stress observation and to think about what are your transferable skills. This isn't about me. This is about you. And I guarantee that you have some transferable skills in this thing. And you might not want to go that I went with this disaster management guy, but I share that, because time feels of the essence right now when it comes to this work. Climate change is here. Disasters are here. It feels like every day we're looking at the news about something else going on. So there is something to thinking about how you can expedite your ability to actually do something valuable with this skill set. And that's part of why I share that story, because that's kind of my one piece of my example of doing that. So hopefully you took something from that one. I'm going to go back to the whiteboard here. Oh, Zoom, what are you doing? Hold on. Whoa, sorry, Zoom just did something really weird there when I went to go share my screen. Let me try this again. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let's go back to our slideshow here. So in essence, to finish off my story, my passion now.
Maximize your slide, make it a little bigger.
I can. I just have to go in and out of that because I'm not able to change it well, but I'll do my best. So my passion now is really about bridging kind of what I learned in emergency and disaster management, working for this large firm and working with municipalities, hospitals, and stuff. I've since stopped doing that work, and I've actually gone out on my own, and I do private consulting now. But what I'm kind of calling holistic emergency management is bridging the best of like modern Western tactical emergency management and the things we learned from that top-down approach with things like community and relationship building, with permaculture and what we learned from homesteading, and with nature-based knowledge of the land. And I really believe when we put those things together, we create a really well-rounded and holistic skill set that feels very relevant going forward in the world that we're in right now, So I'm going to come back to this one later. We are starting a course next week, so that is part of why we're running this class tonight, to let you guys know about the course. But I'll come back to that one at the end. So the first thing I want to share here, or the next thing I want to share, um, in some levels, disaster management is actually simple. So I shared that this can feel like an overwhelming topic for people, and it can be. But here's what makes it simple. The first 2 points on here was actually something I learned from that guy, Daryl, my first day on the job. He sat me down that first morning. He said, "Hey, Chris, I know you're kind of new to this and you're jumping into this, but he's like, disaster management is actually quite simple." He said, really, it's about creating distance between the people or whatever you want to protect and the disaster. And it's about creating more time around it. Time before it happens, time during, and time after. And he's like, almost everything we do is about time and distance, disaster management. And I was like, wow, cool. That actually sounds kind of simple when you put it in that framework. Beyond that, a few things that are really that helpful, and make it more simple is clear communications, right? That's huge in disaster management, and often the lack of clear communications causes more disasters. And I'm gonna, we don't have time to dive in this in depth tonight, but I want to say that a component of clear communication is actually like deep personal work, like literally shadow work, and working with your own ego. Because sometimes in disasters, communications need to happen really fast and promptly. Sometimes they even come out kind of bluntly and harshly. And to work in that environment and not actually be offended by somebody kind of snapping at you is actually part of the skill set, To be like, oh, Charles just kind of yelled that at me. Charles doesn't hate me. He actually just needs this to happen fast. He's overwhelmed. There's a million things going on. Instead of me feeling the need to defend myself or being hurt, I should just do what Charles told me in this moment. There's this kind of component of getting over our own ego, recognizing the chaoticness of it, and that shadow work, so we can actually communicate in a way that's efficient. When we do the debrief, we can get into the like, oh, well, you could have said that in a little bit of better way. We don't necessarily want to say that in the moment when we actually need to save lives or save environment. We need to put out the fire. Afterwards, we can chat about how to get better with our communication. So I just kind of preface that shadow work and ego piece there that I think are actually very relevant to the skill set. To be humble is a very useful skill set in disaster management. Two other things there, and these are maybe getting a little bit more away from the simple, but dynamic awareness and adaptability are just two traits. Being able to kind of be aware, hold awareness of multiple things at the same time, and then being able to adapt on the fly are really, really important skill sets to have. So if you're thinking about, what do I need to cultivate to do this work, you may want to think about like, how adaptable am I? How aware am I of what's going on in my head, but also what the people are saying around me and what the weather's doing and what that sound is, and working on expanding that awareness and then being able to adapt with it as part of that skill set. So you can do this, in essence, you want to learn some frameworks to organize the information that you have to work with, to organize the people you have to work with, to organize the equipment you have to work with, and to be able to think ahead. And I'm going to speak to those frameworks in a moment. You want to get good at building relationships. The stronger those relationships are, the better they're probably going to hold up under stress, and the better that communication is going to be under stress. And, being able to make things happen, it's really valuable to have relationships and to kind of know who does what, who can provide what in a different scenario, and what you can provide and vice versa. Being able to observe and ask good questions. In permaculture, again, we have that first principle of observation and this idea of taking patterns and turning them into details. I gave you an example of doing that at the disaster conference with Daryl to actually land my job in one day. I basically looked at a pattern that wasn't helpful. I looked for some details that were, and had a job. But when I go into a consulting job, I'm doing the same thing. So often an organization will hire me and I come in to work with the organization and I'm just getting spewed a ton of different information and I'm chatting with everybody I can. I'm gathering as much information as I can. And at first it's very chaotic, and it is kind of overwhelming. But with practice, you actually get good at being like, it's actually okay. It's chaotic right now. It's supposed to be chaotic in this moment. It's supposed to be scrambled. And I have a framework to actually ask good questions and then organize that chaotic, find the patterns, and from the patterns, come up with the details for what we actually need to do. That's a process I was able to learn. Ironically, tracking wildlife has improved my ability to do that in emergency management. That's a whole nother conversation. If you want to chat about that one, reach out to me. But this is why I started off chatting about, this indigenous wisdom being so relevant, yeah, so relevant to what we're talking about right now. So we observe and we ask good questions. And then, what you need to do now is think about, okay, I need to learn some things. I need to learn some frameworks. I need to learn a little bit about some of these nuts and bolts. I need to think about it. I need to do some training to actually develop my capacity with it. I need to practice it. One way to get some training is through certifications. I need people to talk about it and debrief it with. And then I need to go out and get some real life experience with it. So in some ways, that is a pathway right there. Learn a few frameworks, build some relationships, observe and ask good questions, learn, think, train, practice, debrief, and get some real life certifications. Trying to make this overly simplified right now. And in some ways it is. So what's my process when I go to work with an organization? So first of all, what do I actually do? That might be kind of helpful for some folks to know. So as I said, I used to work for a large consulting firm. And with that consulting firm, the main area that I worked within was in training and emergency exercises. And I loved working in emergency exercises because this is where we get to basically test the theoretical plans to see how well they hold up under stress. So one of the main things that I used to do with that job is, like, for example, we went into a hospital in Toronto, and this hospital specialized in working with kids that had chronic conditions. So they didn't do day-to-day emerge room stuff. They were just kids with chronic conditions, long-term health issues, but they were a hospital. So they basically hired this consulting firm to come and test our capacity and what are our blind spots. So the mock exercise that we did was a plane crashed in Toronto into the city and created a huge number of casualties. All of the hospitals are now overwhelmed, and this kids' hospital now needs to actually triage adults, which is something they don't do ever, and they're not set up for. But because they're a hospital and it's an emergency, suddenly all these injured people are showing up at the front door. So we actually ran a mock disaster where we literally had like 50 people mock as injured, done up with blood and everything out on the front. And we had their, the administration team, we had real doctors, we had real nurses on call. And they basically had to like improv in the moment a triage system and figure out how to do this and adapt, I've done exercises with municipalities where we've done mock like dams blowing up and parts of the town getting flooded, So running emergency exercises has been a real fun one that I used to do in that world, as well as training. So when I left that world, I started doing consulting on my own. And the emergency disaster consulting is just actually one component of what I do. I also do work in permaculture. I do work in the outdoor education, nature connection, and I do forestry consulting as well. So I do quite a number of things today. Diversity, resilience and diversity. So with my own practice, though, there's a couple things I do. One, I run trainings now. So organizations will actually pay me to come in and run a training, or they'll pay me to come in and run an exercise. And for myself, I don't feel super confident to go in. I felt very good working with a municipality when I worked with this larger team and their other experts, because it wasn't just me. I personally probably wouldn't be confident to go in and take on a municipality on my own now because it's so dynamic and there's so much. And I know what I know. I also know that I don't know what I don't know. But what I did with this is I thought about, where is my niche and where is my experience and where is my passion? Well, I've worked in the world of outdoor education my whole life. I've worked on farms my entire 20s, right? So for me, I actually focus my consulting on farms. I focus it on eco-villages. I focus it on festivals, like music festivals, because I've been to a lot of them and I like organizing events. So also not just festivals, but just events. And I focus it on summer camps and outdoor education facilities because that's what I was brought up in. And all of those things need emergency disaster planning and management, right? So now, for example, like summer camps will hire me and, I might come in and do a staff training on a particular area of emergency and disaster management. Or I might come in and actually run an emergency exercise for the camp. So I've come in and facilitated lost child drills. I've come in and facilitated I've gone to a forest school and we mimicked. So these are a forest school that have no facilities and they're out in urban parks. So we've gone on and done a mock tornado drill for a forest school. So what do you do when you've got a bunch of kids and you're in the forest and there's suddenly a tornado warning or a tornado watch that comes on, right? I also help these same organizations. So I've helped farms write policy for what their farm was going to do during COVID. So I've taken that experience and now I'm actually able to niche out and work within these organizations that are actually really near and dear to my heart, right? So that's kind of what I do. And I want to share a little bit of my process so you can kind of think about, well, how the heck do you actually do that? Like, what do you do when you work with a client? If you're thinking about this as a resume builder, or if you're thinking about this, well, I just want to do this for my community or my family, this same process is maybe helpful for you. So this is the process I developed. The first one is, I build a relationship with whoever the client is, and I want to really understand the big picture. What is their vision? What is their purpose as an organization? That's really important right there. And I want to have good relationships. I want trust. So they trust me. I want to be able to trust them, vice versa, so that we can actually open up and we can go deep with this. So relationship building is huge in all of this. The next thing I do is this thing we call the hazard identification and risk assessment, which is one of the frameworks I've gotten from modern emergency management. This is a component of, all government does this from the federal level right down to the municipal level. The Red Cross does this, FEMA does this. Emergency Management Ontario does this. This is like a framework that's used really around the world. It might have a different name, but the essence of it is the same. Is we want to look at what are the hazards that this organization, that this farm, that this municipality, this business, this family, this community, what are the hazards they could face? What's the risk of them actually happening? What's their vulnerability if it happens? And I have a framework that I go through. This framework is the foundation of the plan. Because once I've kind of mapped out the hazards, the risks, the vulnerabilities, we know how to actually now take this overwhelming amount of information I've gathered about the organization. I take this huge list of possible hazards. So that's like the big picture mess. Now I take this HIRA framework, and that allows me to start organizing it from big patterns into details, right? And from those details, I can actually come with concrete, clear steps and actions to actually help. The second part of this hazard identification is this idea of a critical risk or critical infrastructure assessment. What is the infrastructure that this community, this family, this business, this municipality, this farm, this festival, like what do they rely on to keep people safe, to keep things rolling, to keep people hydrated, to keep the farm animals watered, And what are the vulnerabilities to that infrastructure? From there, we do a bit of a survey of, what is that organization's actual capacity? What do they have available for them? What kind of vulnerabilities might they have? What are the people like that actually work for them? And what are their skill sets like? Where do they have room to grow in this process? So this is all kind of the observe area. We're basically collecting information. We're organizing from patterns and details. And through those first three things, I start to understand the nuts and the bolts of whoever I'm working with, the client. Then I need to ask the question, what's actually realistic given the amount of time that they have? So basically the amount of time with me, but then also how much time do they have day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year? I want to think about how much time they have. I need to think about their budget. But again, their budget to pay me, but also their budget day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. Like how much money can they spend or not spend? And what kind of capacity is actually realistic? If we come up with a big elaborate plan, but it's not actually realistic for their time, their budget, or their capacity, then it's just a bunch of theoretical nonsense that doesn't help. And unfortunately, I can tell you that a lot of municipalities and even provinces and states, their emergency plans are theoretical nonsense. They're based on people that have a lot of time to think and haven't been very realistic about the actions to actually pull it off or ground truth that wouldn't even work. And what you'll find in emergency planning is often we have really great ideas in our head. And then when we go to apply them in the field, the idea in our head actually falls apart and didn't look out. I often tell people in emergency planning, when we make emergency plans, your plan will be wrong. Like it will be most of the time. That's not the point. The value is in the planning process, not the plan itself. The planning process is the value. We're constantly refining the plan because there's always going to be we don't know what we don't know. It doesn't matter how long you've done this for. I've been doing this for a decade now. The guy I work for had been doing it for 40 years, and he still has blind spots. That's why humility is important as well. When I go in as an emergency manager, I'm not the expert that knows everything about emergencies. In fact, often my client is the expert because they know their day-to-day processes. They know what goes on the ground. I'm there to actually be the kind of standing back, big picture eyes to kind of connect the dots and find the holes and fill it in. And some things I have expertise in and I can help them with. Other things, it's like, hey, I don't actually know what you should do about this, but I see this hole. And they might not have seen the hole before. And my job is to see that hole. And now we can collectively figure out a solution for that, right? So that's another thing just to know when you're starting out. You don't actually have to know all the answers to do this work. You do need to be able to stand comfortable not knowing all the answers. You need to be able to stand there and take in a vast amount of information. And you need a system and a process to organize it into actual action steps to find the holes, to find the things that are strong and make them stronger. So that's actually your skill set and your job, more so than actually being a nitty gritty expert in any one detail of things. Hopefully, the people you're working with actually have some of that expertise and they're teaching you. You're helping them fill in the holes and make that web stronger as your job in this. And then once I've done that first part of the process, then I basically just go through the disaster planning cycle. So I was just chatting about evaluating, but now we make a plan. Okay, what am I going to do with this client to help them? And then what do I want the client to actually create as their plan once I walk away and leave them? So we make a plan. And then once we plan, we need to organize. We organize the people, we organize the equipment around the plan. And then we might, in that plan, identify, okay, there's some very specific skill sets we need. For the hospital, the skill set was how do we set up a triage at the front door? The skill set might be how do we use a two-way radio or first aid or communication? How are we going to communicate across this festival? So when we identify those areas that have a very specific skill set, we train in those skill sets, and then we run an exercise. And the exercise tests our plan. It tests the organization that we did of the people and the equipment, and it tests the skill sets we trained on. Inevitably, we find a bunch of holes in that. We debrief it, and we just keep going. And this disaster cycle is not something you do once. This is something you do indefinitely, over and over again. The more time you do it, the more resilient the plan is, the more resilient the people involved in the plan is. So that's my process in essence right there. I just need to move this for a second here. Whoa, what's going on there? Okay, so a couple things here before we start to wrap up. And I want to give you some real kind of concrete thoughts on next steps if you're kind of feeling inspired to integrate this. So what are some of the opportunities that actually exist to go out and do this work? I mean, the first one is just on a personal and community level. And you very much may be here being like, no, I'm not going to work in emergency management. I'm not looking to take courses and certs, but I want my personal family or I want my community to be more resilient to climate change. When we look at some of the things going on right now, whether it was the landslides that happened in North Carolina, the snow that's happening down in the US South right now, the wildfires out in Los Angeles, the hurricanes, geez, pick your one, bird flu, like boom, 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 boom. All in the last like 12 months. It's kind of wild. There's a huge amount of grassroots organizing that happens on the fly when those events happening, right? The reality is our emergency services are stretched thin. They have an almost impossible job. And when big disasters help, governments often don't have the capacity to show up as the saviors that a lot of people want them to be. And that's not to say that they don't help and do useful things, but a lot of people kind of just, if something happens, fire, police, emergency services, they'll come and take care of it. And when big disasters happen, that's actually not the case. What often happens is communities find themselves on their own for periods of time, or they get very limited support, right? And you actually have to organize on a grassroots level. The more you can do ahead of time to organize, the much better you're going to perform when stakes are actually high and things are on the line. So one layer of this is actually just implementing this stuff on a community or personal level. The next layer would be the professional level. You may want to actually go and get a job. Like there are all kinds of jobs in emergency management. Like you could go and work for the government at any level, state level, provincial level, federal level, municipal level. All of those have emergency management job levels. A lot of NGOs, especially larger non-governmental organizations, actually have emergency planning departments or safety committees. Even businesses, a lot of larger businesses have safety committees that actually talk about, the emergency planning and policies for the organization. So there's actually paid work opportunities, even long-term jobs in those professional realms with this emergency management background. We don't have time to get into it today, but you might want to write this one down if you're interested in that professional stream. Look up the concept of business continuity planning, BCP, business continuity planning. So business continuity plan is actually working with businesses in the private sector to actually make plans for emergencies and disasters. And interesting enough, my wife and I actually run a business that sells wild forage foods and medicines. It's called Wild Muskoka Botanicals. So that's another kind of hat I wear, although it's, 90% her project. But because I'm so into emergency management, we actually created a business continuity plan for her business when we first got going. And when COVID struck, we hit a lot of hurdles with the business, but we actually did pretty well. And we know a lot of businesses that went under during COVID. It was really sad. A lot of really great small businesses. It affected a lot of families really negatively, and we survived. It was tough, but we made it through. And part of it is because we had actually done some business continuity planning ahead of time. So, even, maybe you don't want to go out and work in the corporate world, but there's actually the ability to do this BCP planning with like those small local businesses or small local organizations if you can find ones that see the need and the budget for it. I'll also share that there are grant opportunities because a number of the organizations that have hired me have actually applied for grants and then they've hired me under the grant. So I do a lot of work in the nonprofit sector. And there's grants for climate change adaptation. So I did a bunch of work with an organization out west where they basically applied for a climate change adaptation grant and then hired me under that to come and go through that whole process I just shared with them. It might be valuable for you to even know a little bit about the grants out there, because if you work in permaculture and you actually want to do work in this field and somebody approaches you and say, hey, I would love you to do this for us, but we don't have the money. If you can direct them to a grant, then that might be the money to actually bring you in and make the project happen, And then the last realm there is private consulting, which is kind of what I've been talking about. I basically work in the realm of private consulting now. Here's some helpful things along this pathway that might be useful. First off, getting a higher level wilderness first aid certificate, I think, is actually super valuable. It looks good on a resume, but it also helps you with that risk management process. And what you learn in wilderness first aid, especially the higher level ones where you're doing a lot of scenarios, and there's scenarios in remote environments, the difference between wilderness first aid and standard first aid is all about like the ambulance is going to be here within an hour. So we're basically keeping the person alive and comfortable until the ambulance comes. Wilderness first aid is like the ambulance or the hospital might be 24 hours or more away. It might be 3 days away. So they actually teach you way more protocols in a wilderness first aid, and they teach you way more about how to think about managing medical conditions with improvised situations and improvised gear, because higher care is not available right away. In urban disasters, you're often in that more wilderness context because higher care might not actually be available. Even though you're in the city, the ambulance maybe isn't coming in a disaster because the ambulance is overwhelmed. So suddenly having this wilderness first aid is applicable even in the city, right? But it also teaches you to think about risk. It teaches you to think about the risk analysis process. It teaches you how to triage and be like, there's 10 bleeding people around me right now. Which one do I work with first? That's a hard question to answer. Advanced Wilderness First Aid helps you with that. That process is absolutely applicable when you get into emergency management. Beyond that, you can look at college level. Community colleges often have weekend courses. So instead of signing up for a 4-year degree, you just go and take a weekend course. And that's what I did. I started taking a couple weekend courses just to learn some foundations. And then through that, I started getting some certs. Sorry, I used the abbreviated one there, but the first one I put up there, ICS, actually stands for Incident Command System. They have like level 100, 200, 300, 400. I think it ends there. I think you can even do the ICS 100 and 200 online. It's a great foundation for actually organizing people and departments in an emergency. So if you want to get into emergency management, I would highly suggest you take the online Incident Command System 100 course as a starting point. If you're in the US, you can do that through FEMA. Here in Canada, Emergency Management Ontario has a list of where you can do the ICS courses. I did it through a college. CERT is a certification you might look, Community Emergency Response Training or TEAMS in the US. We don't have that one up in Canada, so I don't know as much about it. But in the States, I think it's a pretty foundational one that you probably want on your resume. And the last one I want to chat a little bit about here is the course we have coming up with Earth Activist Training. It's actually starting next week. It's going to be Tuesday afternoons, the same time as this class. And it's basically called Emergency and Disaster Planning, Building Resilience for Organizations, Business, Communities, and Individuals. I'm going to be the lead teacher. Charles is going to be on a bunch of the calls, so he'll probably weigh in a little bit. Starhawk's going to come in for one call. Starhawk's going to be coming on to be chatting about wildfires as well as community organizing. We also have another guest instructor coming in, Layla Darwish, who actually works for Emergency Management British Columbia. And she's going to be talking a lot about community organizing and kind of the equity and diversity piece in emergency management and some of her tool sets around that. And then I'll be leading the rest of the journey. And really, our goal with this class, is to help you build the peace of mind that you actually have solid plans in place, systems in place, and training in place. You have the confidence that you have the tools to actually serve your community or your organization, your family. And for those of you that are thinking about this as an actual resume builder, that process that I shared with you that I went through where we talked about the HIRA, the hazard identification, the critical infrastructure, all those things right up to the plan, train, organize. That basically is the course. Like we're going to dive into the nitty gritty of each of those ones each week. And I'm going to actually have you make a plan. If you work for a business already, then you can actually start working on the plan for the business. Maybe you run a festival in the summer. You can start working on the plan for the festival. Maybe you work for an NGO, or maybe you just want to do it for your family or community. You're going to come out of this course with a framework for a plan and a good chunk of that framework actually even roughed out. And I'm going to teach you how to go and run trainings for whoever you're writing that plan for. I'm going to teach you how to create exercises, emergency exercises for that group. So it's going to be a very hands-on experience. We do have a 10% off code right now. So ENDP25 is a code there for 10% off there. So yeah, we got about 7 minutes left here. So I might just open it up and see if there's any questions here. Charles, I think, is going to throw a link up to the course in the piece there. So yeah, if you're interested in diving deep in this stuff and working with me on this, then I would love to have you in this course. We're starting next week. It's going to be basically 2-hour classes once a week, 6 weeks. You're going to come out the other end feeling hopefully much more knowledgeable and confident than you are right now. And if you want to keep going on that journey, you'll have a really clear idea of like what's your next step for developing your skill set. I could keep talking all day, so I might stop right now. Maybe I'll pass it to Charles really quickly and just say, hey, Charles, is there anything you want to throw in there? And then we'll take a couple questions with what's left here.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Good to see so many faces we've seen before. Yeah, I think the things that I would add is there, as Chris has pointed out, there's lots of ways in which to engage, but the most important thing is to do something. Like as disaster strikes, to not be part of the problem that needs to be taken care of. Like what piece can we carry? And we don't have to carry all the pieces, but we need to carry a piece, right? Whatever the piece is for you, there's some piece you have, and what's the role you can play. So find your piece, play your part, and come take Chris's course. It's a great course. And for those who can't attend live because of the timing, it is recorded. So you can engage on a recorded, though we highly encourage people to take it live because then you get the interaction. But it also will have some recordings so that you can engage with that if you just cannot make the time. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to you.
David, you unmute yourself and jump in if you want. You can also write questions in the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself. So you can either unmute yourself, well, maybe raise your hand if you got a question, or throw it in the chat. And it can be about the course or just anything that we covered in the content here tonight. Amen.
All right, Chris, I'm curious about, like, for those who are interested in making this an income stream, like what the level of effort is typically that one might expect for all the training, and number of hours or years or however you might frame that.
Yeah, great. I mean, the first question I think is like, well, what do you actually want to do with it, right? Because I kind of mentioned a couple different pathways. So, if you want to go and work as so Layla, who works for the emergency, I forget the organization, basically British Columbia's emergency management service, she needs to have a college degree for that, basically, right? Or not even college, a university degree. So, if you're thinking like high level government, some level of formal education is kind of essential. In the private realm, though, which is what I've worked in, there isn't any like real baseline minimum. It's really up to the discretion of the company that's hiring you. Or if you're going to go out on your own, it's really about, let me try and say this a little more simply. So high level business, or municipality level, they're probably going to expect a degree. Private firms or private, there's kind of two ways you can go. If you're going to work for like a private organization in this, it really is like what are they asking you to do and what are the bare minimum things you need for that. If you're going to go it on your own, it's about, well, am I confident enough to do this? And can I actually deliver the value to do it, right? Now you're asking a little bit, okay, well, what's the pathway on those different things there, right? How long does it take? Things like that. The confidence, a little bit of that's going to depend on your journey, your personal experience level, how quickly you're able to learn and adapt. I think some people will probably learn and adapt quite quickly. Others might be a little bit slower in that process. There's a number of great certs. So if you started going to that cert world, so the ICS 100 and 200, are you in the US or Canada?
US.
US, yeah. So that CERT, the Community Emergency Response, I would suggest that the first step is actually just to take a couple of those basic courses, and they'll give you kind of a little bit of the landscape. You might even be able to find like a weekend course, whether it's the one we do with EAT actually, because it does it a little bit. But if you were to take like a weekend course in the States, that kind of just shows you the landscape of emergency management in the States. In Canada, we have this thing called the BEM program, Basic Emergency Management. And it's basically like a 30 or 40 hour certificate course that you do. And it really just overlays the entire emergency management structure for the country of Canada. So I did that course in a weekend and was like, oh, cool. Like, I didn't know any of this. This has painted the landscape for me. Now I actually know how to speak the language a little bit. I understand the language. I went and I got the couple ICS courses, and then I literally showed up to an emergency exercise and I started volunteering. So, if you want to work in the private sector, I think it literally could be that. You do a couple basic certs and then go and get some volunteer experience. Here in Ontario, there's different. So if Emergency Management Ontario's website and also George Brown College, they actually have a newsletter through their emergency management department. And they basically send out a monthly newsletter that tells you of all the different exercises that are looking for volunteers. And almost every month there's something going on, right? So they're looking for people all the time to come down. And usually your first gig, you're going to be the person that's getting covered in blood and just being checked through the hospital. But if you go into that and you actually really observe well and really try to understand what they're doing, it's how and it's working, that's how you can start to kind of move up the ladder. Because the quicker you can understand how that's working, the quicker you can see, well, what could I add? How can I add value to this? What can I see myself doing in this? Then it becomes making relationships with the people that might be able to give you that work. And probably starting out, you're going to want to do some level of, you're going to want to work under somebody. So whether that's going and volunteering or taking an entry level position with somebody, I don't know whether you want to work under somebody else or work for yourself. To get to the point where you're working under somebody else at a basic level, it can actually be very quick, like potentially under a year, with a few certifications and some volunteering. To going out on your own, it's really going to depend on your background, but you're probably thinking a couple year journey. Like my journey was under 2 years though, from like when I started thinking about it to when I was actually working for a company. I worked for the company for about a year, well, kind of for a year. And then I started kind of just subcontracting to them and doing my own stuff. What was amazing, the guy I worked for was actually willing to mentor me. So he was fine with me going out and getting my own gigs and was actually giving me tips for my own gigs, which I was really thankful for. So I hope, does that kind of speak to your question?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Gives me
Awesome.
an idea. Yeah.
Sheila,
a couple of things.
Nice to see you again. Oh, sorry, Charles. What were you going to say?
Oh, go ahead. No, finish up. Sorry.
I was just going to take Sheila there and then maybe Beth, and then we'll maybe wrap up or share whatever you wanted.
Yeah, I just gonna a couple things about getting in. There's a lot of other opportunities. Volunteer fire departments. If you're in a rural area, you have volunteer search and rescue. You have all these other support systems. Whenever there's a disaster, think about everybody who might be involved. There are pieces of that you might want to get engaged with. You go into the local, search and rescue, you volunteer there. They pay for all the certs. They tell you when they are and where they are. And you might go with a group of people, and now you're part of a team. And that can launch you into these. So I'd look for other areas where they need civilian support, because governments, if you want to be in some of the government stuff, they cannot pay enough people to respond to a large disaster. They need a lot of volunteer support. So there's a lot of training that happens prior, and getting in on that. There's a lot of good training, a lot of ways. Once you get in, you get to know the people and kind of figure out who you might want to ally with. Also know your skills. Like, I have skills in GIS mapping. Like I might be able to enter in disaster response with this specialized skill I have, which I could launch in that. I mean, even if I didn't have a disaster background, like, oh, I've got the skill that you need. Let me come in that way. Maybe think about your skill set, because you may have something unique that'll put you farther into it than if you're trying to do the same thing everybody else is.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great, Charles. I totally forgot about that one, but actually, volunteer fire and search and rescue are amazing ones because you get tons of training under there, and all the certs I just mentioned very well might be covered for free for you, even in doing it. So those are two great entryways to build experience. Thanks for bringing those two in, Charles. You can also volunteer for like the Red Cross or St. John's. Um, there's lots of opportunities there too. So let's go, Sheila and Shell.
So, my question is, I've taken certs, I've taken a lot of trainings, I've learned a lot. It's changed some of my thought processes or widened them and made them better and deeper. But I think the question I have is, so physically there are things I can't do. I can remember what to do, but if it's something I don't do very often, I won't remember it. I've got the cert manuals. I'm not going to be carrying them around with me, and I sure as heck am not going to pull them out in the middle of a disaster and read it and figure it out. So I guess I'm asking, how does someone who can get the knowledge then be able to retrieve it, like the theory of reading your notes or the theory of grabbing your electrics and looking things up may not be practical. How do you, I mean, the stuff I know without thinking because I've done it enough, but how do I get there? And I'm asking that because I think I'm not the only person that could be in this space, because there's a lot of people I'm trying to get to train themselves, and I'm teaching a lot of emergency preparedness and planning. And so it's like, okay, the more you do this on a daily basis, the less you have to think about it during the real disaster. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I think so. Let me try and answer, and then you can let me know whether I actually understood or not. So, yeah, I think what you're kind of asking is you're saying you've done a lot of training, you have a fair bit of experience, but it's a lot to hold in your head, which it is. It sounds like you actually are doing some work in the field. Like you did imply that you're actually kind of doing some teaching and training already.
Yeah, I'm an emergency preparedness coordinator at a CBO.
Yeah, great. But there's a little bit of this gap because we learn in and we take so much information, and then if we don't use it, it's not there. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, great. So a couple of thoughts there. One part of it is if we're only, and I need to watch myself on this one as well, because it's potentially a similar gap that I have, Sheila. If I spend all my time just teaching emergency management, I can actually fall in that trap that I shared about, that the plan probably isn't going to work. And I'm actually susceptible to that plan. So I actually recognize that if all I'm doing is teaching this stuff, it's all theoretical. And emergency management is not theoretical. It's actually really, really adaptable. So there is something to rounding that out with some volunteer. So whether it's volunteer experience that actually gets you in the field, or that's where the exercises really come in. So it's cool. We've done a bunch of training, but now let's start running. And maybe there's a way, maybe you do run exercises already, but maybe you could integrate more exercises into your work, Sheila. Because by running these really dynamic exercises, that's when you actually expose your own blind spots. And like it's very common where I'm running an exercise for another organization, and like there's something that I didn't think about at all of the plan. And maybe it's even my fault that it's not in there and it shows up. But it was the exercise that brought it up. And now we all learn from it, right? So that's why that exercise piece is so important, to kind of run those mock scenarios, see what comes up. So my guess would probably be exercises, and then anywhere you can volunteer. And I just want to commend you for recognizing that gap, because I have that same one. I got to be careful not being all theoretical with this, because that is actually a liability if this is only theoretical. So hopefully that's helpful there. We got to kind of wrap up in a moment here, but I will jump over to Shell there. And then I'll speak to Beth really quick, and then we'll kind of wrap. Charles, also, I think David's still pinned to the screen. At least he is on my screen. I don't know how to unpin him. So.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. It's Shell here. You may have mentioned it already, but I was multitasking. A part of which I'm hoping there'll be a recording of both this and the chat that'll get sent out. Excellent. So my question is, these exercises that you're talking about, simulations, do you have to have some level of certification or coursework already, or they're totally open to anyone who steps forward to volunteer?
Yeah, get it. Oh, yeah. So when you're going to volunteer for the exercises, most of them you don't need any actual formal background for them. Most of the ones I've come across, they're literally just looking for people.
Right.
Now, often it's people that are coming from emergency management backgrounds because they're trying to get experience, kind of like David asked about, you know. A lot of those people showing up at those exercises are people that were wanting to build their own experience while it's there. And in the exercises, sometimes your amount of experience level might determine what you end up doing. You know, if you're coming in with no experience or no formal experience, then as I said, you might be the person getting paint on you. But don't underestimate that, because there's a ton of value if you can sit in that role humbly and actually observe and
Yeah.
take it all in.
I do have experience, actual professional experience, being a standardized patient for medical schools, where you're basically presenting to people wanting to be doctors or nurses or various.
Oh, cool. Well, that would actually look good if you told the people that, right? And then you can basically kind of work your way up. Now, if you have specific skill sets, though, you might be able to kind of jump to a middle rung position, right? So, and interesting enough, you know, one of the things that I'm relatively good at, because I've actually organized a lot of festivals and events, so I'm pretty good at actually organizing people. And you know, just to kind of go back to my story for a little bit. So I told that story about how I did that. I basically showed up as a volunteer. I saw some needs that weren't being filled and I did them. And I basically got offered an entry level job. And my first job was to basically go into an emergency exercise. And in it, they basically have like a control room where it's like kind of the people running the drill. And that's where we're kind of talking. And we're basically like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. And my first role was very much like note taking and stuff like that. But really quickly in there, because I've organized events, I was kind of able to think ahead a couple of steps of understanding like what needs to get done. So I was able to be really efficient with just passing notes and pick up a couple other pieces in. And literally, like I did that once, and the next time he's like, "Hey, you know, you've got an upgrade already to the next position."
Great.
So you don't necessarily need the cert if you can develop the skill set.
Okay.
There is kind of a framework for designing an exercise. So I would say if you understand the components of an exercise, you know, which is one of the things we're going to dive into this class, if you go into one understanding the components, you're going to pick it all up faster, which is going to probably allow you to kind of move up in position faster as well. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. One of the things that came up for me when you were talking about transferable skills of what you have to bring towards it, I have a history of not only acting but stage management and film production, all of which is juggling a zillion dynamics and movable parts, and frequently in what can feel like an emergency situation, because there's so much that in demand in time right away.
That's a great example. So, you know, a lot of people, if they were applying for whether it's a volunteer or a paid gig, would probably not think to put that on a resume. I absolutely would highlight it and explain why it's relevant, you know, and say, hey, I'm applying for the safety coordinator position for this organization. And I've got a couple certs, and I was the stage production person, and it's relevant to this job because of this. I think that's absolutely relevant.
Even more so if you're a stage manager in a touring company.
There you go. Awesome. Well, all right. Oh yeah. And then Beth there was just asking, you know, Beth was asking about need for social workers. You know, absolutely. It's a big one. Maybe I'll leave with one kind of closing story here and then we'll wrap it. But a number of years ago, back during Hurricane Irma down in the US, everyone probably remembers that one and how destructive it was. Oh, wait, sorry. I'm crossing wires between two stories. No, this was the shooting that happened where was it? At that nightclub a number of years ago that really made the news around the world. Did anyone remember the event I'm talking about? It's kind of foggy in my mind right now.
Was it in Madrid, Spain?
No, this was in the US a few years back.
Florida.
Oh, in Florida. Gay bar.
Yeah, it was that.
Florida.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. Okay, yeah. Okay. So, anyways, that shooting happened in Florida. And so the fire shows up, police shows up, EMS shows up, and it's carnage, like really bad. A lot of the first responders came out of that with serious PTSD and didn't have a lot of tool sets to work with that. Interesting enough, there was an organization down there that was an herbalist organization, a girl named Emily Ruff. I don't know, some of you might know her. She actually works under the lineage of Rosemary Gladstar. And Emily's actually living in Sage Mountain now. I believe she's kind of taken over operations for Sage Mountain. So Emily Ruff is part of, I forget the name of the organization off the top of my head, but they've basically created this whole nonprofit that's like herbal response for disasters. I wish I could remember the name right now, but here's a great example of taking your specific skill sets and filling in a niche that modern emergency management is actually missing. So they created this whole not-for-profit. And in that Texas scenario, they basically identified that there was this massive need for PTSD work with first responders, and that they weren't handling it well on their own. So they actually offered to come in and do a workshop for a group of firefighters that had responded to the mass there, or to the shooting. And sure enough, she said it was really, so this is really interesting. She basically told me that when they showed up for the presentage, everyone was a little bit cold as a group and kind of just like, oh, this is kind of like woo-foo hippie stuff, blah, 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 really standoffish. And, she didn't really get much of a response, and they kind of walked away, and they were just like, okay, well, we tried. Over the next couple of days, a whole bunch of people from the talk, the firefighters, came to them on their own. And when they weren't in that culture that was kind of toxic, they were actually like, I actually need this right now. And maybe I should actually go talk to that girl. And they were literally teaching people like how to work with nervine herbs, how to smudge, how to go out on the land and ground on the land. And now we've got, the firefighters that were like jokingly calling it hippie woo-foo a moment ago, actually coming and being like, hey, can you actually give me some of that woo-foo? Like, I'm actually really struggling and I'll try anything right now. And they actually built really beautiful relations with the fire department and some of the staff on there who are now open to this more holistic approach. So I think there's just a really beautiful example of where, you might take a very unique skill set and be able to fill in a hole within this world of disaster management. And, again, thinking back, David asked me a minute ago, well, how long is the pathway? The traditional pathway, there's like these approaches, but if we're going to actually bring permaculture and equity and nature and all these things that we're passionate about into emergency management, then it might not actually be about following the traditional pathway. It might actually be looking at the gaps and being like, I'm going to actually create something new to fill that gap. And that new thing might actually generate income if I can show the value or demonstrate the value of it and be creative and think out of the box as to how I create it. So that was a great question to finish it off. And I think I'll maybe leave it there with that story. So thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Maybe the last thing I'll just throw into the chat, if anybody does want to reach out to me, my email is, hold on. Oh, how did that happen? Hey, Charles, can you put my email in? My chat thing's all messed up.
Yeah,
it's basically Chris, CHRIS at chrisoutdoors.ca. And my website is chrisoutdoors.ca as well. If you're really interested in some of the nature connection side of it, reading the land, then check out my website. You might be interested in that. If you want to go deeper on what we talked about tonight, maybe consider joining us for the 6-week class. And if you don't take us up on either of those, I really hope that you found some value tonight and you've got some inspiration around how you might apply some of this to whatever you feel called to do with your personal vision and your gifts. So thank you, Earth Activist Training, for hosting, and Charles for being here. And thank you all for taking a bit out of your day to talk about what I think is a very important and timely topic. And yeah, there's my email there. And the website is just chrisoutdoors.ca, not .com, .ca. Thanks, everybody.